The coffee cup in Victoria Reynolds' hand rattled once against its saucer and went still, and in that stillness the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath along with her, because the sound of her palm against Ethan Carter's cheek had not yet finished echoing off the exposed brick walls when every fork stopped moving and every conversation died mid-sentence. A woman near the window lowered her phone slowly, as though afraid the motion itself might shatter something fragile in the air. The barista froze with a milk pitcher tilted halfway toward a cup, steam curling upward and dissolving into nothing. Ethan stood with his head bowed, one hand rising slowly to touch the reddened skin of his cheek, and in the long, unbearable silence that followed, he did not shout, did not clench his fists, did not do any of the things a wounded man might be forgiven for doing. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, breathed in the smell of burnt espresso and rain-damp coats, and thought of his daughter's small handwriting practice sheet waiting on the kitchen table at home. And that thought alone was enough to keep him standing tall inside a moment built to break him. 3 years before that morning, Ethan Carter had been a man with a future mapped out in blueprints and steady promotions, an engineer whose mind found comfort in solving problems that had clean, logical answers. He had a wife named Sarah, whose laugh had a way of making even gray Tuesday mornings feel like something worth waking up for, and a daughter named Lily, barely 4 years old, who had inherited her mother's wide, curious eyes. Then came the rain-slicked highway, the truck that lost control in a heartbeat, and the hospital corridor where a young doctor delivered news that split Ethan's life cleanly into a before and an after. Sarah was gone. Ethan was left standing there holding a little girl who kept asking in a small, trusting voice when her mother was coming home, and there was no answer he could give her that would not break something inside himself all over again. Grief like that does not simply fade with time. It settles into the shoulders, into the way a man holds a coffee mug in the morning, into the long pause before he can answer a simple question about how he is doing. Ethan stopped applying for engineering positions because interviews demanded a version of confidence that grief had quietly hollowed out of him. Instead, he took whatever work would let him be home by the time Lily's school bus pulled up to the corner. He repaired vending machines in the back rooms of gas stations. He delivered packages until his shoulders burned. He mopped the marble floors of office buildings long after the people who worked there had gone home to families of their own. And every single morning, before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, he made breakfast, braided Lily's hair with hands too rough for such delicate work, and told her gently that everything was going to be all right, even on the mornings he did not quite believe it himself. Victoria Reynolds had built an empire out of nothing but sleepless ambition, and from the outside her life looked like a triumph carved in glass towers and magazine profiles. But success for Victoria had cost her something she rarely allowed herself to think about. Years earlier, she had watched her younger brother slip further and further into addiction, while she told herself that getting involved would only make things messier, that he needed to solve his own problems, that compassion was a door people walked through to take advantage of you. By the time she finally reached out to him, it was too late, and the guilt of that timing had calcified into something she mistook for strength. She built walls instead of bridges after that. Her employees respected her sharp mind and feared her cold precision, and almost none of them had ever seen her cry, laugh without restraint, or admit she was afraid of anything, because a woman who lets no one close cannot be disappointed by anyone again. On the morning she walked into that cafe, she had been awake since 4, fielding panicked calls from investors threatening to abandon a merger she had spent 2 years building. And when she saw a stranger sitting at the table she had reserved that morning, something in her, already stretched thin as wire, simply snapped without warning. Standing near the door that day was Marcus Hayes, Victoria's head of security, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who carried himself with the calm of someone who had once stared death directly in the face and lived to tell no one about it. 9 years earlier, Marcus had been a firefighter, a job he had loved with his whole chest, until the night a chemical warehouse fire nearly took everything from him. He remembered it even now in fragments that arrived without warning, the way smoke had turned the world the color of a dying television screen, the way a support beam had groaned once like something alive before collapsing across his legs and pinning him to the concrete floor. He remembered the heat pressing down like a hand on his throat, the sound of his own radio crackling uselessly against his shoulder, and the certainty, absolute and quiet, that these were going to be his final minutes on Earth. Then, through smoke thick enough to swallow a man whole, a stranger had appeared, face wrapped in a soaked bandana, and with strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond simple muscle, lifted the beam just enough for Marcus to drag himself free. The stranger had half carried him through a wall of flame and smoke to the shattered loading dock doors, set him down gently in the cool night air, and vanished back toward the building to search for others before Marcus could even ask his name. Marcus had spent 9 years wondering about that man, sometimes lying awake replaying those final desperate seconds, wondering if he had survived, wondering if he even remembered the stranger he had saved. Standing in that cafe, watching Ethan lift his hand to wipe the sting from his cheek, Marcus caught sight of a jagged scar along his wrist, shaped almost like a lightning bolt, in the exact place a falling shard of metal had once sliced his rescuer's skin. The air left Marcus's lungs all at once. His heart slammed hard enough that he could hear it in his own ears, and he stepped forward, his voice cracking under the weight of 9 years of unanswered gratitude. "It's you," he said quietly, and when Ethan looked up, confused and still reeling, Marcus continued, his eyes shining. "You pulled me out of that warehouse fire 9 years ago. I never got your name. I never got the chance to thank you." The cafe, already silent from the slap, sank into an even deeper hush, the kind of silence that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something sacred.
Victoria stood frozen, her hand still faintly stinging from what she had done, watching her most trusted employee, a man who did not frighten easily, look at this stranger the way people look at something they thought only existed in stories. The ground beneath her did not move, but everything she believed about the man she had just humiliated shifted violently in an instant. This was not an entitled stranger who had disrespected her mourning. This was a man who had walked into fire while everyone else ran from it, who had saved a life and asked for nothing, not even a name, in return. And she had slapped him over a table. Shame rose in her chest so quickly it left her lightheaded. She opened her mouth to speak, but no apology felt large enough to fit the moment. So for once in her life, Victoria Reynolds said nothing at all. Ethan simply nodded at Marcus, the old memory softening something tired in his face. "I'm glad you made it out," he said quietly, his voice carrying no bitterness and no desire for praise, only the quiet relief of a man discovering that a life he once fought to save had gone on to become something good. Then he reached for the small bag of groceries he had set down before the confrontation, gathered his coat, and turned toward the door, because Lily was waiting at home with her spelling words spread across the table, and nothing else in that room mattered more than getting back to her.
Victoria could not simply let him walk away. Something inside her, sealed shut for years, had cracked open, and through that crack came questions she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. She followed him out onto the sidewalk, the autumn wind pulling at her coat, and apologized in broken, unpolished sentences that sounded nothing like the composed executive who commanded boardrooms with a single raised eyebrow. Ethan accepted the apology with more grace than she felt she deserved, told her simply that everyone has hard days, and continued walking, leaving her standing beneath the cafe's awning, staring after a man she suddenly realized she did not understand at all. That night, alone in an apartment far too large for one person, Victoria found herself unable to sleep, replaying the sound of her own hand against his cheek, and beneath the shame was something harder to face, a flicker of old guilt about her brother, about all the times she had told herself that staying detached was the safer, smarter choice. She poured a drink and did not finish it. She opened her laptop to review merger documents and closed it again without reading a single line. For the first time in years, her carefully built armor felt less like protection and more like a room she had locked herself inside. Driven by that guilt and by a curiosity she could not suppress, Marcus asked her to help her learn more about the man who had once saved his life, not to expose his story or turn it into a headline for her company's image, but because something in her needed, quietly and privately, to understand him. What she learned humbled her far more than any failed deal ever had. She learned of Sarah's death, of the abandoned engineering career, of years spent doing whatever work would keep a roof over a little girl's head. Under the pretense of returning a wallet he had dropped during the commotion, she visited his apartment one evening, though in truth she simply needed to see the life behind the man. The apartment was small, the furniture worn but cared for, and everywhere she looked she found quiet evidence of devotion. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator, each signed proudly in a child's uneven handwriting. A row of second-hand shoes waited by the door, scuffed but neatly lined up like soldiers. On the kitchen table sat a stack of school books beside a handwritten chart tracking Lily's spelling words, each mastered word marked with a small hand-drawn star. Through the doorway, Victoria watched Ethan kneel beside his daughter, patiently sounding out a difficult word, his voice warm despite the exhaustion carved into his shoulders. Lily giggled at her own mistake, and Ethan laughed softly along with her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead before pointing back at the page. "Watch this one," he told her gently. "Sound it out slow, just like we practiced. There's no rush, sweetheart." Watching them, Victoria felt an ache rise in her chest that she could not name, and she thought of her own achievements, the awards, the magazine covers, the corner office with a view of the entire skyline, and understood with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that none of it had ever made her feel what this small apartment radiated without effort. This was not a place of poverty. It was a place of wealth, measured in something no amount of money could buy. In the weeks that followed, Victoria found herself changed in ways she had not planned and could not fully control, though the change did not come easily or all at once. She caught herself, more than once, slipping back into old habits, snapping at an assistant over a minor scheduling error before catching herself mid-sentence and, astonishingly, apologizing. She sat through board meetings, biting back the urge to dismiss a struggling employee's excuse, and instead, for the first time in years, asked a simple question: what is actually going on at home? It felt foreign, almost dangerous, to let softness into rooms she had spent a decade guarding with precision and control. But each time she chose it anyway, it grew slightly less unfamiliar. She reached out to Ethan, not with pity, which she understood instinctively he would refuse, but with genuine respect, offering him the chance to interview for an engineering position that matched the talent he had set aside years earlier, a position he would have to earn on his own merit, not one handed to him out of guilt. Ethan hesitated for days before agreeing, wary of anything that might compromise the dignity he had fought so hard to protect through years of harder work than anyone around him ever noticed. When he finally walked into the interview, he answered the technical questions with a steadiness that surprised even him. Old instincts and buried passion resurfacing with unexpected ease, like a muscle remembering movement after a long sleep. When the offer came, he did not celebrate loudly. He simply drove to Lily's school, picked her up, and took her for ice cream, telling her softly that things were about to get a little easier for both of them. Lily, only 7, but wise in the particular way children become when they have already known real loss, wrapped her small arms around his neck and told him she had always
believed he was going to be okay because he never once stopped trying, not even on the hardest days. Months later, at a company event celebrating the launch of a new outreach program Victoria had personally built from the ground up, Ethan stood near the back of the room in a suit that still felt unfamiliar after years of work clothes and delivery uniforms. Victoria took the stage, and rather than delivering the polished speech her communications team had prepared, she set the notes aside and spoke instead about a lesson she had learned from someone who never once asked to be recognized for his courage. "There is a man in this room tonight," she said, her voice steady but softer than anyone had ever heard it in a boardroom, "who taught me that the loudest rooms rarely hold the bravest people, and that I nearly walked past the finest example of courage I have ever witnessed simply because he was quiet about it." She did not use his name, honoring the privacy she knew he valued, but when her eyes found Ethan across the room, she offered him a small, grateful nod, and he returned it with the faintest, most genuine smile she had seen from him since the day they met. Later that evening, Lily fell asleep in the back seat during the drive home, and Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful, even breaths, and allowed himself, for the first time in a very long while, to simply feel grateful. Not for recognition, not for the promotion, but for the reminder that a life could be rebuilt one patient, unglamorous day at a time, and that kindness given without expectation has a way of finding its way home when a person least expects it. If Ethan and Victoria's story touched something in your heart today, we invite you to become part of our growing family here on the Kind Soul Stories. Please take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a story about quiet heroes, second chances, and the extraordinary power of compassion hidden inside ordinary lives. If this story moved you even a little, like this video and share it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness always finds its way home. Leave a comment below with the words, "Kindness always returns," because your words might be exactly what a stranger scrolling through today needs to keep believing that better days are still ahead. Thank you for spending this time with us and for being part of a community that still believes in love, forgiveness, and the strength of good people. This story carries meaningful educational and moral value, reminding viewers never to judge others by appearances, since the people who seem to have the least are sometimes carrying the richest hearts and the deepest histories of unnoticed courage. It teaches that true leadership grows from humility and compassion rather than control, that grief does not have to erase a person's capacity for love and perseverance, and that small, selfless acts of kindness, given without any expectation of reward, can echo forward through years and return to change lives in ways no one could have predicted.